Welcome back to Sleepless History. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're settling in for the night, winding down after a long and complicated day, or simply looking for a quiet companion to carry you through the dark and early hours of the morning, you've found exactly the right place. Tonight, we are going deep into one of the most fascinating, strange, and genuinely underappreciated chapters in the story of how the United States became the country it is today. We are going to talk about Alaska. Not the Alaska of tourist brochures and wildlife documentaries, though we will certainly touch on those things as we go. We are going to talk about the long, slow, complicated, and remarkably human story of how a vast frozen territory, larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined, larger than the next three largest American states put together, changed hands between two empires for the price of about 2 cents per acre. We are going to talk about exhausted Russian diplomats signing treaties in the middle of the night, their pens scratching across paper by lamplight while the rest of Washington slept. We are going to talk about newspaper editors who called the whole thing a colossal joke, who invented mocking nicknames and filled column after column with contempt for a man they thought had lost his mind. We are going to talk about bribery, propaganda, political theatre, and the slow, grinding way that history sometimes makes its turns, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a series of quiet, bureaucratic decisions made by tired men in small rooms. We are going to talk about gold. We are going to talk about oil. We are going to talk about war and about the strange, profound, deeply human stubbornness of a man who was right about something important and had to wait years, decades, for the world to catch up with him. This is the story of Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, the Polar Bear Garden, the Walrus Territory, all the names that people gave in their mockery to what would eventually become the 49th state of the United States of America, a state that would one day generate more wealth than most countries on earth. So let us begin. Let us go all the way back to the beginning. Let us go back to a time when Alaska was not called Alaska at all, when Russia was still a continental empire that stretched from the pine forests of Europe all the way to the rocky beaches of the North Pacific, and when the idea of the United States owning anything north of the Yukon would have seemed not just unlikely but genuinely absurd. If you've tuned in tonight to help your mind drift off, you're in the right place. That's the reason I create these. If you find this helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from and what the time is. I love reading through the comments. There's something surreal about knowing someone is watching at midnight in San Francisco, while someone else is starting their day in Stockholm, or grabbing a quick lunch in Sydney. Chapter 1. The Russian Dilemma, Empire at the Edge of the World. To understand why Russia eventually sold Alaska, you first have to understand why Russia had Alaska in the first place. And to understand that, you have to go back to the early 18th century, to the reign of Peter the Great, and to the strange, cold, almost mythological story of European exploration pushing itself to the absolute edges of the known world. Peter the Great, that towering, restless, contradictory figure who dragged Russia, sometimes quite literally into the modern age, was fascinated by geography. He was fascinated by maps. He was obsessed with the question that nobody in the Western world had yet been able to answer with any certainty. Where exactly did Asia end, and where did America begin? Was there a land bridge? Was there open water? Were there islands? Were there people? Were there perhaps resources? In the last years of his life, Peter commissioned an expedition to find out. He chose a Danish navigator in Russian service named Vitus Bering, a careful, methodical, arguably not very exciting man who was nonetheless exceptionally good at the difficult and dangerous work of sailing through waters that no European had ever charted. Bering set out in 1725, the very year that Peter died, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer the question his emperor had given him. The first Kamchatka expedition, as it came to be known, did not quite accomplish the job it had been set. Bering sailed north through the strait that now bears his name in 1728, proving that Asia and America were indeed separated by water, but the fog was so thick and the conditions so relentlessly miserable that he never actually saw the American coastline. He came home having proved something geographically important, but having seen nothing that anyone could call a discovery in the fuller sense of that word. The second Kamchatka expedition was different. Launched in 1733 and stretching on for years of preparation and planning that would exhaust virtually everyone involved, it finally put Bering and his ships into truly American waters in 1741. On July 16th of that year, Bering's ship, the St. Peter, and the companion vessel, the St. Paul, commanded by the Russian-born captain Alexei Chirikov, finally made landfall on what we now know as the Alaska Panhandle and the Gulf of Alaska. Chirikov's ship arrived first, and he sent 2 small boats ashore to investigate the coastline more closely. Neither boat came back. Whatever happened to those men remains unknown to this day. They may have been killed in an accident on the rocks. They may have been taken in by the indigenous Tlingit people who lived along that coast. They may have simply been lost in conditions that made rescue impossible. But their disappearance cast a long shadow over the expedition that never quite lifted. Bering's own experience was little better. He was already ill. His crew was sick and exhausted from years of preparation and weeks of difficult sailing. And after catching a brief but extraordinary glimpse of the St. Elias Mountains rising up from the Alaskan coast mountains, so large and so dramatic and so unimaginably tall that even hardened sailors reportedly fell silent at the sight. Of them, their snow-covered peaks gleaming white against a sky of impossible blue, he turned for home. He never made it. His ship wrecked on a small island now called Bering Island, off the coast of Kamchatka, and there he died in December of 1741, having barely set foot on the continent his expedition had been sent to find. But here is the thing about Bering's expedition that would change everything. The small detail that would eventually reshape the political geography of the entire northern Pacific. The men who survived the wreck brought something home with them. They brought sea otter pelts. The sea otter, Enhydra lutris, is an animal of almost supernatural beauty and extraordinary warmth. Its fur is the densest of any mammal on Earth, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million individual hairs per square inch of skin, compared to perhaps 20,000 hairs on the entire head of an adult human. The fur is so dense that it never gets fully wet, trapping air next to the animal's skin and providing insulation so effective that sea otters can live their entire lives in water that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. The pelts of sea otters were, in the mid-18th century, among the most valuable commodities in the world. In China, and particularly in the great trading port of Canton, they were worth a small fortune. Chinese merchants valued the pelts for their extraordinary warmth and their remarkable texture, using them to make coats, hats, and trimmings for the garments of the wealthy. A single good pelt could sell in Canton for more money than a Russian peasant might earn in a year. A shipload of good pelts was worth enough to make a man wealthy for life. When the survivors of Bering's wrecked expedition limped back to Kamchatka in 1742 with a cargo of sea otter skins, word spread with remarkable speed. Within a few years, Russian fur traders, the promyshleniki, as they were called, from the Russian word for industry or enterprise, were pushing east across the Aleutian Islands in small, barely seaworthy boats, driven by a hunger for fur that was equal parts economic calculation and frontier recklessness of the most extreme kind. These were not gentle men. The promyshleniki were rough, violent, often brutal traders who operated largely outside the reach of any government authority, in the tradition of frontiersmen everywhere who find themselves in lands where the law of their home country does not reach. Their treatment of the indigenous Aleut people, the Unangan as they called themselves, a name that simply means the people in their own language, was by any honest account a series of sustained atrocities. The promyshleniki took Aleut hunters hostage to force the broader community to hunt sea otters on their behalf. They killed those who resisted. They brought diseases to which the Aleut had no immunity, smallpox, influenza, and other illnesses that swept through the island communities with devastating efficiency. They disrupted the food systems and social structures that had sustained the Aleut people through centuries of Arctic living. The population of the Aleutian Islands, which may have been as high as 25,000 people before contact, collapsed to a few thousand within decades of the Russian arrival. Some estimates suggest the Aleut population fell by as much as 80% in the first century of contact. Russia's claim to Alaska was built, as so many colonial claims were, on violence and exploitation. This is not a pleasant thing to say, but it is an honest one, and the history of Alaska cannot be told truthfully without it. The great wealth that Russia would eventually extract from these territories was built on the labor and the suffering of people who had no say in the matter. By the late 18th century, Russia's presence in Alaska had coalesced into something more organized, if not necessarily more humane. Catherine the Great, that formidable and ambitious empress who ruled Russia for more than 3 decades, was interested in consolidating and rationalizing the country's Pacific possessions. She sent expeditions to survey and map the coastline more thoroughly. She established formal administrative structures for the fur trade. She was aware, as any intelligent ruler of her time had to be, that Spain, Britain, and even France were also interested in the North Pacific, and that Russian claims needed to be backed by something more solid than the activities of semi-piratical fur traders. The British explorer James Cook sailed along the Alaskan coast in 1778 during his third and final voyage, the voyage that would end with his death in Hawaii. Cook's charts of the Alaskan coastline were excellent, and his expedition's reports of the abundance of sea otters in the region helped spark British and American interest in the Pacific fur trade. The British maritime fur trade, centered in the Pacific Northwest and operating from the port of Nootka Sound on what is now Vancouver Island, grew rapidly in the 1780s and 1790s and brought Russia into competition, sometimes tense competition, with British merchants. The Russian-American Company, chartered by Tsar Paul I in 1799, was the response to this competitive pressure. The company was given a monopoly on the fur trade in Russian America, the name Russia gave to its Alaskan territories, and was charged with administering and defending them. It was modelled partly on the great trading monopolies of the European colonial era, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, private enterprises invested with governmental powers. But it was a smaller, less well capitalized, and more poorly supplied version of those models, operating in conditions that were far more difficult. The first governor of Russian America, worth remembering in any detail, was a man named Alexander Baranov, a tough, stubborn, often intoxicated, but undeniably capable merchant from the Russian north who ran the territory for nearly 2 decades, with a combination of sheer willpower and improvisational genius of a high order. Baranov had come to Alaska not as a trained colonial administrator, but as a merchant and entrepreneur, and he approached the problems of governing a remote territory with the practical creativity of a man who knows that no help is coming and that he must make do with what he has. It was Baranov who established the settlement at Sitka, called Novo Arkhangelsk, which means New Archangel, in honor of the northern Russian city of Arkhangelsk on the coast of what is now the Alaska Panhandle, after fighting a fierce and bloody battle with the Tlingit people who lived there and who had destroyed an earlier Russian settlement in 1702. The second attempt at Sitka succeeded, and the town gradually grew into something approaching a proper colonial settlement with a governor's house, warehouses, workshops, a church, and eventually a school and a small library that Baranov was proud of. Sitka would become the capital of Russian America, a small town of a few hundred people clinging to the edge of a vast and indifferent wilderness, periodically supplied by ships that came around Cape Horn from St. Petersburg, a journey of many months and enormous expense, or by trading vessels from California and Hawaii, or by whatever could be obtained locally. The town had a cosmopolitan character that surprised visitors, Russian administrators and company employees, Aleut and Tlingit, workers and servants, American and British traders, Hawaiian laborers brought north by the ships of the Pacific trade, and a small community of Creoles, as the children of Russian men and native women were called, who occupied a peculiar middle position in the colonial social order. And this brings us to the first of the great structural problems that would eventually convince Russia to part with Alaska, the problem of distance and of the extraordinary cost of sustaining a far-flung empire at the end of an essentially impossible supply line. Russia's American possessions were, by any rational calculation, extraordinarily difficult to sustain over time. They were separated from the Russian heartland by the entirety of Siberia, one of the largest and most inhospitable landmasses on Earth, a vast expanse of taiga, tundra, mountains, and rivers that could absorb entire armies without trace, and then by the Bering Sea. To send a man from St. Petersburg to Sitka in the early 19th century was a journey of perhaps a year or more, depending on the route taken and the season of travel. To send supplies was enormously expensive. To defend the territory against any serious military challenge was, as Russian planners increasingly understood as the century wore on, essentially impossible. The Russian-American company's response to this problem was creative, if ultimately not successful. They tried to make Russian America self-sufficient, or at least more self-sufficient than it currently was. They established farms on Kodiak Island, the large island off the southern coast of Alaska, to provide food for the northern settlements. They built a settlement called Fort Ross on the California coast, just north of what is now San Francisco, to grow grain and vegetables for the Alaskan settlements. The location was chosen because the climate of coastal California was mild and agriculturally productive in ways that Alaska could never be. Fort Ross was a strange little outpost, a Russian settlement in Spanish California, operating by informal agreement with the Spanish and later Mexican authorities who nominally governed the region. It never quite fulfilled its intended purpose. The climate was fine, but the soil was thin, and yields were never sufficient to make the territory genuinely self-supporting, but it maintained a presence on the California coast for nearly 30 years. It was eventually sold in 1841 to a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter, who was building a large agricultural and commercial enterprise in the Sacramento Valley. The same John Sutter, as history would note with a certain irony, on whose land gold was discovered in January of 1848, triggering the Great California Gold Rush that transformed the American West. The Russians had sold their California property 7 years before the gold was found, and the timing was one of those historical coincidences that makes the past feel almost like a story someone made up. Even while Fort Ross operated, it never quite solved the supply problem. Russian America was always dependent, always expensive, always more trouble than it was strictly worth from the perspective of any rational accounting exercise. The territory operated essentially as a drain on the resources of the Russian-American company and, increasingly, on the resources of the imperial government that backed it. The fur trade, meanwhile, was collapsing. And collapsing in exactly the way you would expect when an enormously valuable natural resource is exploited without any meaningful management or conservation. The sea otter, that miraculous creature whose pelt had drawn Russia east across the Pacific in the first place, had been hunted with such ferocious efficiency that by the early 19th century its populations were crashing dramatically. The Promyshleniki and the Aleut hunters they pressed into service had been, in a terrible sense, too good at their jobs. They had killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. Sea otters, as it happens, are slow reproducing animals that live in relatively small, geographically defined populations. A female produces at most 1 pup per year, and pup survival depends on the mother's ability to devote herself almost entirely to its care for months at a time. When you kill adults faster than the population can replace them, you do not get a gradual decline, you get a collapse. The hunters had worked their way systematically eastward across the Aleutian chain, exhausting each island group's otter population before moving on to the next. By the time they reached the coasts of mainland Alaska and the waters around Kodiak and the Kenai Peninsula, the western Aleutians were largely empty of otters. And the hunt continued east, toward the Gulf of Alaska and the Panhandle, while behind the hunters, the emptied waters slowly and painfully began to recover, generation by generation, in numbers far smaller than they had once been. By the 1840s and 1850s, the Russian-American company was struggling financially in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to disguise. Its dividends, once impressive enough to attract investors, had dried up. Its operations required more subsidy from the imperial government than they generated in return. The territory was still there, still claimed, still nominally Russian, but it was costing money rather than making it. And the gap between cost and return was growing wider with each passing year. And then came the Crimean War, and everything changed. The Crimean War, which lasted from 1853 to 1856, was one of the most consequential conflicts of the 19th century, and it is today somewhat underappreciated in the English-speaking world, perhaps because its main theatre was distant from Western Europe and America, and perhaps because its causes were enormously complicated in the way that great power struggles always are. In its simplest terms, Russia found itself at war with an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, France, Britain, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, fighting over influence in the declining Ottoman Empire and, more broadly, over the question of who would dominate the Black Sea and control the approaches to Constantinople. Russia lost. It lost decisively, and in a way that shocked the Russian government and Russian society deeply. The Peace of Paris in 1856 was humiliating. Russia was forced to give up territory, to accept restrictions on its naval presence in the Black Sea, and to confront the deeply uncomfortable truth that its military machine and its economic foundations were not competitive with the Western European powers that had been arrayed against it. The defeat set off a period of intense internal soul-searching, reform, and reflection that would reshape Russia over the following decades, including the great emancipation of the serfs under Tsar Alexander II in 1861. But, for our story. The most important consequence of the Crimean War was not what happened at the negotiating table in Paris. It was what almost happened in the Pacific, in the waters off Alaska, and what that near miss revealed about the fundamental vulnerability of Russia's American possessions. During the war, Russia had found itself in a profoundly exposed position in North America. British naval power was formidable. The Royal Navy was, at that time, the most powerful navy in the world, by a wide margin, and British Columbia was immediately adjacent to Russian America. The Royal Navy could, in theory, have sailed into the waters around Sitka and destroyed or occupied the Russian settlements with considerable ease. Russia had no significant naval force in the Eastern Pacific capable of mounting any meaningful defense. In the event, the British did not press this advantage with full commitment, partly because of the complex diplomatic geometry of the war, and partly because Russian America was genuinely difficult to attack with decisive effect. There were no major military installations, no concentrated population, nothing that could be meaningfully captured and held in a way that would translate into negotiating leverage. But the vulnerability was real, and it was recognized on all sides. Russian military planners and diplomats were uncomfortably aware that their American territory was essentially indefensible in any serious conflict. The aftermath of the Crimean War thus confronted Russia with a strategic question that had no comfortable answer. What exactly was the point of Russian America, given what it now cost and what it now risked? The fur trade was declining. The territory was expensive to supply. It could not be defended against a serious naval attack. It was so far from the Russian heartland that it would always be more of a liability than an asset in any major conflict. What could possibly justify the continued expense and risk? These concerns were sharpened by a particular geopolitical theory that was gaining currency among Russian strategic thinkers in the 1850s and 1860s. The theory went something like this. Russia's most dangerous long-term rival in the Pacific was not Britain. Despite the recent unpleasantness of the Crimean War, Britain's interests in the Pacific were primarily commercial, centered on trade routes, the China coast, and the protection of existing colonies. The more dangerous long-term rival was the United States, an aggressively expanding continental power that had recently demonstrated, by its war with Mexico in the 1840s, that it was perfectly willing to use military force to extend its territory, and that its appetite for land was not yet satisfied. American expansionism was, by the middle of the 19th century, something that any thoughtful strategic analyst had to take with great seriousness. The doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief widely shared among Americans and elevated to a kind of civic religion that the United States was divinely ordained to spread its civilization and its governance from sea to shining sea, was not merely rhetoric. It had already driven the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of the Oregon Territory through negotiation with Britain, and the conquest of California and the entire American Southwest from Mexico. There was no particular reason to think this expansion would stop at the Canadian border. Russian-American territory, in this analysis, was a particularly tempting target for American expansionism because it was right there, adjacent to the growing American presence in the Pacific Northwest, accessible to American ships, and already being penetrated by American traders, whalers, and fishermen who had little regard for the nominal sovereignty of the Russian-American company over these waters and these coasts. The theory that some Russian strategic thinkers were developing, call it the barrier state, concept, or the buffer strategy, ran roughly as follows. If Russia sold Alaska to the United States, two things would happen that would work in Russia's strategic interest. First, Russia would receive a significant sum of money that could be directed toward the internal development and military modernization that the Crimean defeat had made so urgent. Second, and perhaps more importantly in strategic terms, Alaska would become a buffer zone between British Columbia and the growing American Republic. The British and the Americans would then share a long and potentially contentious border along the entire length of the Pacific Northwest, with all the friction and rivalry that such close proximity between competing powers typically generates. Russia, relieved of an indefensible and expensive territory, would gain a strategic benefit in the ongoing great power competition in the Pacific without spending another ruble on the problem. This was, in its own cold-blooded way, a rather sophisticated piece of geopolitical thinking. The logic was not unlike the logic that drives many diplomatic transactions. Find a way to turn a liability into a benefit, and if you can do so while simultaneously creating friction between your rivals, so much the better. Whether this theory fully drove the eventual decision to sell Alaska, or whether it was simply one element in a larger calculus, is something historians continue to debate. But it was unquestionably part of the intellectual framework within which key Russian officials approached the question of what to do with their American possessions. The man who would most forcefully and persistently push the idea of selling Alaska was a Russian diplomat named Eduard von Stokel, who served as Russia's minister to the United States for many years and who would eventually find himself at the center of the midnight negotiations that sealed the deal. Stokel was a European-born diplomat who had entered Russian service and built his career in Washington, where he had developed an unusually deep understanding of American politics and an unusually broad network of American contacts. He had married an American woman. He understood the American political system from the inside, in a way that most foreign diplomats never quite managed. Stokel had been discussing the possibility of selling Alaska with various Americans, formally and informally, for years before the actual transaction took place. The idea had been raised as early as 1854, during the Crimean War itself, when the Russian-American company had apparently floated the idea of a fictitious sale of the territory to an American company as a way of protecting it from British seizure. If the territory nominally belonged to an American company rather than to the Russian state, British naval forces would have to think twice about attacking it. The idea had not come to anything concrete at that time, but it had planted a seed. In 1860, there was a more serious, informal exploration of the idea, involving representatives of both governments. Nothing came of that either, largely because American politics was in the convulsive state that would shortly lead to the Civil War, and nobody in Washington had time to think about Alaska. But in 1866, with the Civil War over and the United States beginning the difficult work of reconstruction, Stokel received clearer signals from St. Petersburg that the Tsar's government was genuinely prepared to sell. The Russian Foreign Ministry had concluded that the strategic logic of the sale was sound, that the price of maintaining the territory was too high relative to any benefit it provided, and that the moment to act was approaching. Stokel was authorized, in general terms, to explore the possibility of a transaction with the American government. The American counterpart he needed to find was William Henry Seward. Before we follow the story to the State Department on that late March night in 1867, let us take a few moments to understand who Seward was and why Alaska mattered so much to him. Because Seward is one of the most significant American statesmen of the 19th century, and he deserves more than a supporting role in this story. Chapter 2. The Man with a Vision, William Seward, and the Midnight Negotiations. William Henry Seward was born in 1801 in a small town in the Hudson Valley of New York, the son of a doctor and merchant who was prosperous but not wealthy. He was educated at Union College in Schenectady, read law, and came to practice in Auburn, New York, which would be his home for the rest of his life. He entered politics early and rose quickly to the New York State Senate, to the governorship of New York, and then to the United States Senate, where he served for 12 years and established himself as one of the most prominent politicians in the country. Seward was, by the standards of his time, a genuine progressive. He was one of the earliest prominent politicians to take a clear and unequivocal stand against slavery, and he did so in language that made him many enemies. His 1850 speech, in which he declared that there was a higher law than the Constitution, meaning a moral law that required opposition to slavery regardless of what the law of the land might say, outraged conservative politicians of both parties and cost him votes in the 1852 and 1856 and 1860 presidential contests. He was, for a time, the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860, but his reputation for radicalism on slavery and on other issues frightened the moderate Republicans who controlled the party machinery, and the nomination went instead to Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. Seward was disappointed, genuinely so, but he was also a practical politician who understood the arithmetic of the situation. Lincoln offered him the position of Secretary of State, and Seward accepted. He would serve in that role for the remainder of Lincoln's presidency, and then through the presidency of Andrew Johnson, a total of nearly 8 years in office. As Secretary of State, Seward demonstrated qualities that had not been entirely visible in his earlier career: extraordinary diplomatic skill, genuine strategic vision, and a kind of patient, persistent intelligence that was different from the more flamboyant intellect he had shown in the Senate. He was the man who kept Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy during the Civil War, a diplomatic achievement of enormous consequence that is not given nearly enough credit in popular histories of the conflict. European recognition of the Confederacy could have changed the entire trajectory of the war, providing the South with diplomatic legitimacy, access to credit, and potentially military support. That it never came was due, in significant part, to Seward's careful, relentless work in London and Paris. Then came the night of April 14th, 1865, and what happened to Seward on that night tells you something important about the kind of man he was. John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy to decapitate the Union government on that single terrible night included not just the assassination of Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theatre, but simultaneous attacks on Vice President Andrew Johnson and on Seward himself. The attack on Johnson never came. The man assigned to kill him lost his nerve at the last moment. The attack on Seward was carried out by a co-conspirator named Lewis Powell, a large, powerful young man who had been a Confederate soldier and who arrived at Seward's home that night under the pretense of delivering medicine. Powell forced his way into the house, brutally beat Seward's son Frederick, who tried to stop him, and forced his way into Seward's bedroom where the Secretary of State was lying in bed. Recovering from a serious carriage accident that had occurred just days before, what happened next was horrific by any description. Powell stabbed Seward repeatedly, slashing his face and neck, wounding other family members who rushed to the room, and fleeing into the night. Seward survived. He survived because the metal jaw splint he was wearing from his carriage injury deflected the knife away from his carotid artery. Without that splint, he would almost certainly have bled to death. As it was, the wounds were serious and permanently disfiguring. He bore the scars for the rest of his life. He kept working. Within weeks, he was back at his desk at the State Department. Within months, he was pursuing the agenda that he had been working on throughout the war, an agenda of American expansion and commercial power that reached far beyond the continent of North America. Seward believed, with a conviction that was both prophetic and unfashionable among his contemporaries, that the age of purely continental expansion was drawing to a close and that the future of American power lay in the Pacific Ocean. The United States had, by the middle of the 19th century, reached the Pacific. The era of filling in the continent was largely complete. What came next, in Seward's vision, was oceanic American commerce, American influence, and eventually American power extending across the Pacific to Asia, dominating the sea lanes that connected North America to the markets of China and Japan and India. For this vision to be realized, the United States needed strategic positions along the Pacific ports, coaling stations, islands, and coastlines that could serve as the foundation of a genuinely oceanic commercial empire. He had his eye on Hawaii, which he would have liked to acquire but could not manage during his time in office. He had his eye on various Caribbean islands, and he did manage to negotiate a treaty for the acquisition of the Danish West Indies, though it was never ratified by the Senate. He was interested in any territory that could serve as a stepping stone, a base, a link in the chain of American commercial and naval power that he saw extending across the Pacific. And he had his eye on Russian America. Russian America fit perfectly into Seward's vision. It had a long, complex coastline with excellent harbours. Its waters were extraordinarily rich in fish and marine mammals. Its position at the northwestern corner of the continent gave it proximity to Asia. The Great Circle route from Seattle to Tokyo actually passes through Alaskan waters, meaning that Alaska is not remote from Asia, but rather adjacent to it, if you think about the globe in the right way. And its size meant that it would add enormously to the physical extent of American territory and to the length of the American Pacific coastline. When Stokell returned to Washington in the early months of 1867, carrying what amounted to a mandate from St. Petersburg to negotiate a sale, Seward was ready. He had been thinking about this for years. He knew what he wanted. What happened next has been reconstructed from the recollections of those who were present and from the historical record, though some details remain uncertain and the accounts are not entirely consistent with each other. What is clear is that the negotiations moved with extraordinary speed, that both principal parties wanted to reach a conclusion quickly, and that the final agreement was reached in circumstances that have become one of the more evocative scenes in American diplomatic history. Seward and Stokell met on the evening of Friday, March 29th, 1867. They had been in communication for some time, and both men had a reasonable sense of where the other's limits lay. Stokell wanted at least $5 million for the territory. He would have preferred more. Russia's internal discussions had contemplated asking as much as $10 million at some point in the planning, but he had flexibility and he wanted to close the deal. Seward believed that something in the range of $5 to $7 million was achievable and defensible politically. According to the account left by Frederick Seward, the Secretary of State's son and close assistant, the culminating moment came on the evening of March 29th, when Stokell arrived at the Seward home unexpectedly. He found the Secretary of State at the card table, engaged in a game of whist with family members and friends. Whist was a popular card game of the era, a predecessor of bridge, and Seward was reportedly an enthusiastic player. When Stokell indicated that he had received final authorization from St. Petersburg and was ready to conclude the negotiations, Seward's response was immediate. "Why wait till tomorrow, Mr. Stokel?" he reportedly said, rising from the card table. "Let us make the treaty tonight." This was not the kind of behaviour that was typical of Victorian-era diplomacy, which usually proceeded at the stately pace of formal correspondence and scheduled meetings. But Seward was not a typical diplomat, and the speed with which he moved reflected his understanding that political windows are fragile things, that a treaty agreed tonight might be a treaty undone by tomorrow's changing circumstances, and that the time to act on a good opportunity is when it presents itself. The two men, along with their staffs and necessary clerks, gathered at the State Department. Lamps were lit, papers were spread across tables. The process of drafting the formal language of the treaty began. This was meticulous work that could not be hurried, even if the principals had wanted to hurry it. A treaty transferring sovereignty over 600,000 square miles of territory required careful attention to every word. The boundaries had to be specified, with reference to the treaty lines established in earlier agreements with Britain in 1825. The rights of the inhabitants had to be addressed, however inadequately. The disposition of the Russian Orthodox Church's properties had to be settled. This was a point that Stokel had been instructed by St. Petersburg to protect, since the Church had invested significantly in schools, churches, and other infrastructure in the territory, and Russia wanted those properties preserved rather than confiscated. The price had to be negotiated to a final number. Stokel had authorization to accept $7 million. Seward pushed for $7.2 million, reportedly arguing that the additional $200,000 would help compensate the Russian-American company for the costs it had incurred in the territory. Stokel agreed. $7.2 million it was. The night stretched on, the clerks wrote, the diplomats reviewed the language. Outside, Washington slept in the late March darkness, unaware that one of the most significant territorial transactions in American history was being concluded by lamplight in the State Department. By 4 o'clock in the morning of March 30th, 1867, the Treaty of Cession was complete. It was a document of modest length. Formal diplomatic treaties of the era were considerably shorter and less baroque in their language than many modern agreements. But what it said was enormous in its implications. Russia agreed to cede to the United States all the territory and dominion that Russia then possessed on the continent of North America and in the adjacent islands. The United States agreed to pay $7.2 million in gold within 10 months of ratification. It was signed in the early morning darkness by Seward and Stokel, witnessed by a small group of exhausted clerks and diplomatic staff. The United States had just agreed to purchase Alaska. Now, all that remained was to get the Congress to pay for it. This was, as it turned out, considerably harder than the signing had been. The treaty was transmitted to the Senate the very next day, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee began its deliberations almost immediately. The chairman of that committee was Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and his role in what followed was pivotal. Sumner was, at this point in his long career, one of the most powerful and most intellectually formidable men in the Senate. He was also, it must be said, one of the most difficult a man of absolute moral convictions, enormous ego, and the kind of thoroughness in his preparation that occasionally crossed the line into what his colleagues politely described as exhaustiveness. Sumner spent weeks preparing for the committee's consideration of the treaty. He read everything available about Russian America. He corresponded with men who had direct experience of the territory. He consulted geographers, naturalists, and historians. He built, in other words, exactly the kind of comprehensive case that the treaty needed someone to build, because Seward, who was not beloved in the Senate and who was associated with the deeply unpopular Johnson administration, was not well positioned to make that case himself. When Sumner finally spoke to the Senate on April 9, 1867, the speech lasted 3 hours. It was, even by the expansive standards of 19th century Senate oratory, a comprehensive and detailed treatment of the subject. Sumner ranged across the geography, natural history, indigenous peoples, economic resources, and strategic significance of the territory, with the thoroughness of a man who had genuinely mastered his subject. He was persuasive, detailed, and for those with the stamina to follow him through all 3 hours, genuinely illuminating. And in the course of that speech, he gave the territory a name, Alaska. Sumner proposed, derived from the Aleut word Alyeska, meaning roughly the Great Land or mainland, the name the Aleut themselves used to refer to the Alaska Peninsula, the long finger of land extending southwest from the Alaskan mainland. The name was accurate, evocative, and not incidentally considerably more dignified than any of the mocking nicknames the newspapers had been using. The name stuck. Whatever else one might say about Charles Sumner, he gave the territory something it deserved, a name worthy of its size. The Senate ratified the treaty on April 9, 1867, by a vote of 37-2. The ease of that ratification, well above the required 2/3 majority, surprised some observers and disappointed the treaty's critics. But the Senate vote, however decisive, solved only part of the problem. To actually pay for Alaska required an appropriation from the House of Representatives, and the House was a different matter entirely. The formal transfer of the territory from Russia to the United States took place on October 18, 1867, in a ceremony at Sitka that was, by most accounts, a profoundly strange and somewhat melancholy affair. A Russian honor guard lowered the Russian flag over the town's main building. A group of American soldiers raised the American flag in its place. The Russian soldiers, who had been garrisoning the territory, stood in formation. The local Tlingit population watched from a respectful distance, having no particular attachment to either flag. Several of the Russian women who had come to watch reportedly wept, and then the Russians left. Or most of them did. The ships departed. The Russian-American company's presence in the territory effectively ended. What remained was a handful of company employees who had chosen to stay, a community of Creoles who were, by this point, thoroughly rooted in the territory. The indigenous populations who had never been asked their opinion of any of this, a small detachment of American soldiers who had arrived to establish American presence, and the Russian Orthodox churches with their distinctive onion domes rising above the Sitka tree line. Alaska was American, except that Congress had not yet paid for it, and did not seem to be in any particular hurry to do so. Chapter 3. Seward's Folly, the Mockery, the Propaganda, and the Bribes. The American press of the 1860s was a creature of a particular moment in the history of journalism, a moment when newspapers were the primary medium of public information and opinion, when partisan commitment was worn openly and without apology, and when the line between reporting and advocacy was drawn more or less wherever the editor felt like drawing it on any given day. The great newspapers of the major American cities were powerful institutions with strong personalities, and they competed with each other for readers and influence with the ferocity that has always characterized the journalism business. The position that most of them took on the Alaska Purchase was, in its essentials, that it was a joke, a very expensive joke, being played by a Secretary of State who had apparently taken leave of his senses. The Mockery began almost immediately after the treaty was made public, and it was creative in its contempt. The New York Tribune, edited by the influential, cantankerous, and endlessly opinionated Horace Greeley, was among the first to coin the phrase that would stick in the public imagination, Seward's Folly. The paper argued with vigour and frequency that the purchase was a waste of public money, that Alaska was a frozen wasteland of no practical value whatsoever, and that Seward, who had been a major political figure and a serious contender for the presidency, had finally, irredeemably, lost his mind. Other papers were equally dismissive, though they varied their terminology with a creativity that, in retrospect, one cannot help but admire despite its wrong-headedness. Seward's Icebox was widely used, while Russia appeared in several papers, combining walrus and Russia in a way that was presumably intended to evoke both the territory's frigid climate and its association with large, ungainly creatures of no commercial value. Polaria was proposed as a name for the territory by various commentators. Frigidia appeared in print. One paper described Alaska as a barren, worthless, God-forsaken region. Another described it as a national icehouse. The New York World was particularly harsh, publishing a series of editorial pieces that treated the purchase as evidence of either spectacular incompetence or something worse than incompetence. The Harper's Weekly cartoonist, Thomas Nast, one of the most influential political illustrators of the era, a man whose cartoons of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall had genuine political effect, produced drawings mocking the purchase, depicting Seward standing in snow surrounded by icebergs and walruses, looking pleased with himself, while the American taxpayer looked on in horror. Some of the criticism was substantive, or at least attempted to be. Critics pointed out, fairly enough, that Alaska was largely unexplored and that its resources were genuinely uncertain. Nobody had mapped the interior. Nobody had assessed the agricultural potential of the southern coastal regions. Nobody had done a serious survey of the fisheries. The gold and silver deposits that some suspected might exist in the mountains had not been found. The petroleum resources that would eventually prove to be the territory's greatest economic treasure were entirely unknown. The critics were not wrong that Alaska's value was uncertain. They were wrong in assuming that uncertainty meant worthlessness. Critics also argued that the United States already had more territory than it could effectively govern. Reconstruction was, after all, consuming enormous quantities of energy, money, and political attention. The South was a vast, complicated, deeply damaged region that needed fundamental reorganization, and Congress was struggling with every aspect of that reorganization. Adding another vast, distant, and administratively challenging territory to the national agenda seemed, to many, like the wrong priority. Some critics raised a point that was not entirely unfair, even from a sympathetic perspective. What, exactly, would the United States do with Alaska? The fur trade was already declining. There was no known agriculture possible in most of the territory. It was almost entirely unmapped and largely uninhabited by people who would be counted as American citizens. The infrastructure required to connect it to the rest of the country did not exist and would cost a fortune to build. The territory had no roads, no railroads, and only the most rudimentary communications. What was the plan? Seward had a plan, or at least a vision, but the vision was long-term, somewhat abstract, and dependent on commercial and technological developments that had not yet occurred. He believed in the commercial future of the Pacific Ocean as the great arena of global trade in the coming century. He believed that Alaska's fisheries, which were genuinely enormous, even if not yet commercially exploited on a large scale, would eventually be extraordinarily valuable. He believed that the territory's strategic position gave the United States an important foothold in the Northern Pacific that would pay strategic dividends over time. He believed, with a confidence that was partly genuine prescience and partly the stubbornness of a man who knows he is right when the evidence is not yet clear enough to convince everyone else, that the skeptics were simply wrong. But visions do not translate well into newspaper headlines, particularly when the vision requires patience and a long time horizon that political and journalistic culture is not designed to appreciate. Seward was not a man who explained himself patiently to his critics in the press. He pressed forward with the conviction of someone who had already had this argument inside his own head and resolved it, and who found relitigating it with people who had not done the same thinking to be tiresome. The Senate ratification had been relatively smooth, as we have seen, largely because of Sumner's effective advocacy. But the House appropriation was a far more difficult matter. The year 1867 was, in American political life, one of the most turbulent and contentious in the nation's history, even by the extraordinary standards of the Civil War era. Andrew Johnson, who had become president after Lincoln's assassination, was locked in an increasingly bitter, increasingly personal, and increasingly constitutional struggle with the radical Republicans in Congress over the fundamental question of how to reconstruct the defeated South. The radical Republicans wanted to transform the South, to guarantee the rights of the newly freed people, to redistribute land and power, and to impose a period of military governance before readmitting the Confederate States. Johnson wanted a rapid, lenient restoration that would essentially allow the pre-war Southern power structure to reconstitute itself, which was, in the eyes of the radicals, tantamount to handing the fruits of the war's victory back to the defeated side. This struggle would culminate in 1868 in Johnson's impeachment by the House of Representatives, the first presidential impeachment in American history, and his narrow acquittal by the Senate, where he survived the removal vote by a single vote margin that is one of the most dramatic moments in the history of that body. In this political environment, anything associated with the Johnson administration was viewed by the radical Republicans who dominated Congress with deep suspicion at best and active hostility at worst. Seward was Johnson's Secretary of State. The Alaska Purchase was, therefore, an administration initiative in the eyes of the radicals, and they were not inclined to help the administration succeed at anything. The House appropriation for the purchase became entangled in the larger war between Congress and the President, a casualty of a political struggle that had nothing to do with the merits of the Alaska question itself. There was also a genuine constitutional question being raised by some House members that was not entirely without merit. The treaty power under the American Constitution belongs to the President, and the Senate, the President negotiates, the Senate ratifies. But the power of appropriation belongs to the House. What some House members were arguing was that the executive and the Senate had together presented the House with a fait accompli, a completed deal that the House was now expected to pay for without having been consulted or having had any voice in the decision. This felt, to those members, like a violation of the House's proper constitutional role. Whether or not this argument was legally sound, and scholars have debated it ever since it was politically powerful, it gave members who opposed the purchase for other reasons, or who simply opposed the Johnson administration for any reason, a principled-sounding justification for dragging their feet. The appropriation debate stretched on through late 1867 and into 1868, a period during which the territory it concerned was in a genuinely peculiar legal limbo. Russia had formally transferred possession of Alaska at the Sitka ceremony in October 1867. The Russian flag had come down and the American flag had gone up. Russian authority had ended, but American authority was ill-defined because Congress had not appropriated the money, had not organized the territory, and had not passed any laws governing it. The small detachment of American soldiers in Sitka had no clear legal basis for their presence beyond military orders. American commercial law did not apply. The territory was, for practical purposes, a legal no-man's land. In Sitka itself, the situation was increasingly chaotic and dispiriting. The Russian population, mostly employees of the Russian-American company and their families, was departing. Many of the buildings the company had maintained were being abandoned. The infrastructure the Russians had built, modest but functional, was deteriorating without maintenance. The American soldiers, without clear authority and without the resources to govern, were essentially camping in a town that was rapidly becoming a ghost of its former self. The Tlingit people watched all of this with understandable skepticism. They had never been fully under Russian control, and the transition to American authority seemed, from their perspective, to offer little that was clearly better and considerable that was clearly worse. The American soldiers brought different problems than the Russian administrators had presented, and the absence of any organized civilian government meant that there was nobody with clear authority to address disputes or enforce any kind of order. And this is where the story gets genuinely murky, because what happened to finally push the House appropriation to a vote has been the subject of considerable historical controversy, and the evidence, while suggestive, remains incomplete. The specific figure that historians have focused on is $200,000, a significant sum by the standards of the time, which was apparently paid out of funds controlled by Stokel in the weeks and months leading up to the House vote. The money appears to have been drawn from the funds that had been appropriated for the purchase itself, but not yet paid over, a fact that adds a certain uncomfortable circularity to the whole arrangement. Where exactly this money went has never been fully and definitively established. The evidence is fragmentary, and the men involved were understandably not forthcoming about the details. What the available evidence points toward is a combination of payments to newspaper editors and publishers to secure more favorable coverage of the purchase, payments to lobbyists and advocates who worked the corridors of the House, and quite possibly direct payments to members of Congress or their associates, though this last category is the most difficult to document with certainty. Robert Walker, a former senator from Mississippi and former Secretary of the Treasury under President Polk, became one of the most energetic and prominent advocates for the Alaska Purchase during this period. Walker was a consummate Washington insider, a man who knew everybody and who understood how things got done in the Capitol. He wrote articles, gave speeches, lobbied members of Congress, and generally threw himself into the campaign for the appropriation with a vigor that seemed somewhat disproportionate to any obvious personal interest he might have had in the outcome. It is widely believed by historians that Walker was paid for his services from Stokel's discretionary funds, though the exact amount remains uncertain. The Washington newspapers were approached, and some of them shifted their editorial positions in a more favorable direction during this period. The National Intelligencer and other Washington papers that had been skeptical of the purchase became, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, more supportive. Whether this was due to genuine persuasion, to financial arrangement, or simply to the natural drift of editorial opinion as more information became available about the territory's resources, is in most cases impossible to determine at this remove. What is perhaps most interesting about the propaganda campaign that accompanied the appropriation battle is how modern it feels in its methods. The combination of newspaper advocacy, expert testimony, organized lobbying, and what might charitably be called institutional outreach to key decision makers is not fundamentally different from what large commercial and governmental interests do today to shape public and legislative opinion. The scale was smaller, the tools were cruder, and the methods were less refined. But the basic logic was the same. If you want to move a political institution that is inclined to inertia or opposition, you must shift the information environment in which it operates, create the conditions for political cover, and make it easier for members to vote the way you want them to vote than to vote the other way. The House appropriation finally came to a vote on July 14, 1868. The vote was 113 in favour to 43 against, a comfortable majority. The $7.2 million was appropriated. Russia was paid. Alaska was, at last, fully and legally and financially American. The total amount of money spent on the Alaska purchase, counting both the treaty price and the costs of the advocacy campaign, was something over $7.4 million by most historical estimates. It remains, in inflation-adjusted terms, the most remarkable piece of real estate ever acquired for the price. There is one final detail worth mentioning in this chapter, a detail that illuminates the almost absurd gap between the mockery with which the purchase was greeted and the reality of what had been acquired. Among the papers who had most vigorously mocked the Alaska purchase was the New York Tribune, the paper that had coined the phrase Seward's Folly. 25 years after the purchase, in 1892, the Tribune ran an editorial reassessing the acquisition. By that time, the Alaskan fisheries were generating millions of dollars annually. Gold had been found in several locations in the territory, and the strategic value of America's Pacific position was increasingly recognized. The editorial was not quite an apology, because 19th century newspapers did not really do apologies, but it was an acknowledgement that perhaps the mockery had been premature. Seward was not alive to read it. He had died 20 years earlier, in 1872. But even had he been alive, one suspects he would not have been particularly interested in the Tribune's belated acknowledgement. He already knew he was right. He had always known. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Peoples and the Territory in Limbo. There is a version of the Alaska Purchase story that is entirely about the transaction, about the diplomats, the money, the political battles, and the eventual vindication. That version is satisfying in its clarity and its arc, a story of visionary statesmanship eventually rewarded by historical judgment. But there is another version of the story, less clean and considerably more uncomfortable, that centers on the people who were in Alaska before either Russia or the United States arrived, and what the purchase meant for them. This version is not often told with the same enthusiasm as the story of Seward and Stokel and the midnight negotiations, but it is equally true, and we cannot honestly tell the story of Alaska without it. Alaska in 1867 was not empty. Let us be very clear about that. It was home to an extraordinary diversity of indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years in some cases, for more than 10,000 years, and who had developed complex cultures, sophisticated technologies, deep spiritual traditions, and intricate social structures specifically adapted to the extraordinary demands of their environments. These were not primitive peoples or simple peoples. They were accomplished peoples who had solved problems of survival that would challenge any modern human placed suddenly in their conditions. Along the coast and on the islands of the Aleutian chain lived the Unangan the people, commonly called the Alets, though Unangan is what they called themselves. The Unangan had been the workforce of the Russian fur trade, and their story is, as we have discussed, a story of catastrophic loss. Their population had fallen by perhaps 80% in the century after Russian contact. They had been forcibly relocated, taken hostage, worked to exhaustion, and exposed to diseases for which they had no immunity and no treatment. By 1867, the Unangan communities of the Aleutian Islands were a fraction of what they had once been, and the survivors were deeply embedded in a relationship with the Russian-American company that, whatever its exploitative character, at least provided certain necessities and certain structures of governance. When the purchase was announced and the Russian-American company began to wind down its operations, the Unangan communities faced an immediate and practical crisis. The structures they had been living within, however oppressive, were collapsing around them, and nothing was being put in their place. American commercial interests moved into the vacuum, and they were not, in general, more considerate of Unangan welfare than their Russian predecessors had been. The Pribilof Islands, that small group of rocky outcroppings in the middle of the Bering Sea that hosted the world's largest population of northern fur seals, were a particular case study in what American administration meant for indigenous Alaskans in the years after the purchase. The Unangan people of the Pribilofs had been brought to those islands by the Russian-American company to serve as the labor force for the annual seal harvest, and they had lived there for generations, developing their own distinctive community within those extreme and beautiful islands. After the American purchase, the United States government granted a monopoly on the Pribilof seal harvest to a private company, the Alaska Commercial Company, based in San Francisco in 1870. The arrangement replaced the Russian company's management of the harvest with American commercial management. From the perspective of the Unangan of the Pribilofs, the difference was not always immediately apparent. They were still the labor force, still dependent on the company for many necessities, and still not in control of their own economic destiny. The conditions of their labor and the compensation they received were determined by others, as they had always been. Along the southeastern coast, in the Panhandle region around Sitka, the Tlingit people occupied a different position. The Tlingit were, and had always been, a more independent and more powerful force than the Unangan. They were organized into an intricate social structure of clans and moieties, governed by elaborate protocols of rank, reciprocity, and ceremony. They were accomplished artists. The totem poles, weavings, and decorated objects produced by Tlingit artisans are recognized today as among the great achievements of indigenous North American visual culture, and they were warriors who had demonstrated on more than one occasion that they were willing and able to resist colonial encroachment by force. The Tlingit had never been fully subjugated by Russia. The Russian-American company had coexisted with the Tlingit in a relationship of sometimes violent, sometimes commercially productive, and always cautious negotiation. The Russians needed Tlingit labor and Tlingit trade. The Tlingit needed access to certain Russian goods. A modus vivendi had been reached, though it was never entirely stable. The transition to American authority disrupted this arrangement without replacing it with anything better. The American soldiers who arrived in Sitka had very different attitudes toward indigenous peoples than the Russian administrators had had, shaped by the long and violent history of American frontier relations with native peoples in the lower 48 states. Attitudes that assumed native peoples were obstacles to be managed or removed, rather than communities with whom a working relationship needed to be maintained. This was not merely an abstract cultural difference. It had immediate practical consequences. Disputes arose over trade, over land use, over access to resources. The Tlingit had no legal framework within which to assert their rights. because the American legal system had not been extended to the territory in any organized way. The soldiers had authority without law. The Tlingit had rights, historical rights, moral rights, the rights of people who had lived in a place for generations but no legal mechanism for asserting them. The treatment of Alaska's indigenous peoples in the decades after the purchase is a long story that cannot be told in full in 10 days. A single episode, but its broad outlines are important to know. The territory was not formally organized by Congress until 1884, 17 years after the purchase. During those 17 years, Alaska's indigenous peoples experienced a governance vacuum that was filled, in practice, by military authority, commercial exploitation, and the slow, grinding advance of American settlement and commercial activity that showed little interest in indigenous land rights or community welfare. The Organic Act of 1884, which finally established a basic civil government for Alaska, was a step forward from the complete absence of civilian governance, but it was limited in important ways. It did not establish Alaska as a formal territory with the full rights that territorial status normally implied. It did not address indigenous land rights at all. It established a limited court system and some basic governmental functions, but it left fundamental questions unresolved. The question of Alaska Native land rights would remain unresolved for nearly another century. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, passed more than 100 years after the purchase, was the first comprehensive attempt to deal with this question. It was, and remains, a controversial piece of legislation. Some Alaska Native leaders praised it as an important recognition of their community's rights. Others criticized it for failing to provide adequate land and resources. And still others argued that it undermined traditional governance structures by channeling land rights through Western corporate forms. The story of the Alaska Native peoples is not a story of passive victimhood. These are communities with long histories of resilience and adaptation, who have survived extraordinary challenges and maintained their cultures through circumstances that would have destroyed less rooted and less resourceful peoples. But it is a story that includes real and serious injustice. And the Alaska Purchase was a pivotal moment in that story, the moment when one colonial power transferred the territory to another without any meaningful consideration of the interests of the people who actually lived there. There is a detail from the Treaty of Cession itself that illustrates this clearly. The treaty states that the uncivilized tribes of the territory, the offensive language was standard diplomatic terminology of the era, would be subject to such laws and regulations as the United States might from time to time adopt regarding Aboriginal tribes. This was not a guarantee of rights. It was not an acknowledgement of existing rights. It was a placeholder, a deferral of the entire question to an uncertain future, a statement that said, in essence, that the United States would figure out what to do about the indigenous people of Alaska at some point later when it got around to it. That deferral lasted, in important ways, for more than a century. The Russian Orthodox Church, whose presence in the territory had been explicitly protected by the Treaty of Cession at Stoeckel's insistence, was in many ways the most functional institution serving Alaska Native communities in the years after the purchase. The church had been in Alaska since the late 18th century, and by 1867 it had established a significant presence, churches, schools, and mission stations throughout the territory. Many of its clergy were of native or mixed native and Russian ancestry, deeply embedded in the communities they served. The church had done something that few colonial institutions of the era attempted. It had invested in indigenous languages. Religious texts had been translated into Aleut, into Tlingit, into other indigenous languages. Literacy, in the local language as well as in Russian, had been spread through the church's educational work. When the American Purchase eliminated most other Russian institutional presence, the Orthodox Church remained, a living connection to the Russian period that served primarily the spiritual and social needs of native communities rather than the commercial interests of colonizers. The contrast between the Church's continued presence and the chaotic, often exploitative character of the American commercial and governmental activity that filled the post-purchase vacuum was noticed by sympathetic observers at the time. Some American missionaries, arriving in Alaska with the ambition of converting native peoples to Protestant Christianity, found themselves competing not just with indigenous spiritual traditions, but with a well-established Orthodox Christian community that had indigenous roots and indigenous leadership. The results of that competition were not always edifying. Let us also take a moment to consider the Russian citizens who remained in Alaska after the transfer. The Treaty of Cession had given Russian subjects living in the territory the right to return to Russia within 3 years, and those who did not do so would become American citizens. Most Russian-American company employees chose to return to Russia, as one would expect their reason for being there had been the company, and the company was gone, but some stayed. The Creoles people of mixed Russian and indigenous ancestry who had been born in the territory and who knew no other home had no particular reason to go to Russia, a country most of them had never seen. Many of the Orthodox clergy stayed, as we have noted. A small number of Russian traders and entrepreneurs chose to remain and try their luck under American governance. For these people, the transition was complicated. They had been promised citizenship, but citizenship without organized government or law is a somewhat abstract thing. The social hierarchies of the Russian period, in which Creoles occupied a recognized middle position between Russian employees and native workers, had no equivalent in the American system. Creoles found themselves reclassified, in the American scheme of things, in ways that were not always clear or comfortable. The experience of the Russian period in Alaska, for all its violence and exploitation, had also produced something: communities, relationships, a mixed culture of Russian and indigenous elements that the American period was not well prepared to acknowledge or accommodate. The history of Alaska is not simply the history of what American civilization built there. It is also the history of what was already there when American civilization arrived, and what happened to it in the years that followed. The territory would struggle with these questions throughout its years of American governance, and the struggles are not entirely resolved even today. Land rights, resource rights, cultural preservation, the recognition of indigenous governance structures, these are live issues in Alaska in the 21st century, still being worked out in courts and legislatures and community meetings 150 years after the purchase. But even as we acknowledge these complications and injustices, we must also follow the larger story of what Alaska became in American hands, because that story is, in its own way, as remarkable as anything else in this history. Chapter 5. The Vindication Gold, Oil, and the 49th State. The skeptics who called Alaska Seward's Folly had, in their defense, a certain kind of point. At the moment they were making it, in 1867, the resources of Alaska were genuinely uncertain. The fur trade was declining. The fisheries were unproven at commercial scale. The interior was largely unmapped and entirely undeveloped. There was no agriculture to speak of, no significant timber industry, no mining of any scale, no towns of any size beyond Sitka's small population. If you looked at what Alaska was in 1867, the skeptics were not entirely wrong to wonder what exactly the United States had paid for, what changed Alaska's reputation, and what vindicated Seward's vision in the most dramatic possible way came in stages. And the first of those stages was, in a very real sense, one of the most dramatic events in American economic and social history. The 1890s were a decade of deep economic pain in the United States. The Panic of 1893, triggered by a combination of railroad overexpansion, agricultural price collapse, and bank failures, sent unemployment soaring to levels not seen since the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Farms were foreclosed. Banks failed. The general mood was one of desperation and uncertainty that affected ordinary Americans in every part of the country. In the summer of 1897, in the middle of this depression, a ship called the Excelsior docked at San Francisco and another ship called the Portland docked at Seattle. And men walked off those ships carrying something extraordinary. One description from a contemporary newspaper account conveys something of the sensation it caused. Men were staggering down the gangplanks under the weight of bags and boxes and suitcases stuffed with gold. Gold dust, gold nuggets, gold bars, not a little gold. A staggering, almost unbelievable quantity of gold. The Klondike Gold Rush had announced itself to the world. The gold had been found not in Alaska itself, but in the Yukon Territory of Canada, in a remote tributary of the Klondike River, by prospectors working through the summer of 1896. George Carmack, a white American prospector, and his taggish First Nations companions, Skookum Jim and Dawson Charlie, discovered the first major deposits in August of 1896, and word spread through the small, tight-knit community of prospectors and miners who worked the far north with the speed of rumor in a closed community. By the time the ships arrived in Seattle and San Francisco in July of 1897 with their extraordinary cargoes, the entire Pacific Northwest was already humming with excitement. Within days, the news was everywhere in the country, and the response was immediate and enormous. A population desperate for economic relief, bored with the grinding poverty of the Depression years, and deeply susceptible to the romantic appeal of sudden wealth in a distant wilderness, that population responded to the news from the Klondike in the only way it knew how. It went north. Somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 people attempted the journey to the Klondike between the summer of 1897 and the spring of 1898. They came from all over the United States, from Canada, from Europe, from Australia, from everywhere that the news of gold had reached. They came by ship to the Alaska Panhandle. They came overland through British Columbia. They came by routes that had been used only by indigenous peoples and the hardiest of frontier traders for generations. The primary entry point was Alaska specifically, the port of Skagway, a tiny coastal settlement that was suddenly confronted with a population surge of almost incomprehensible proportions. Skagway went from a handful of people to a chaotic, violent, exciting boomtown of several thousand almost overnight. Hotels, saloons, supply stores, and brothels appeared with the speed of canvas and lumber and determination. The streets were mud, the prices for everything were outrageous. And through the middle of it all, a constant river of human beings moved northward, bound for the passes that led into the Canadian interior. There were two main routes from Skagway over the mountains into the Yukon watershed. The White Pass, named for Thomas White, a Canadian government official, was a longer route that was theoretically passable by pack animals, but that became, in practice, a scene of such widespread animal suffering that it was known for years afterward as the Dead Horse Trail. for the thousands of horses that died on it. The Chilkoot Pass was shorter but steeper, requiring those who used it to climb what was essentially a nearly vertical wall of ice and snow, sometimes in blizzard conditions, carrying the ton of supplies, a literal ton, required by Canadian authorities to ensure that stampeders entering Canada had enough food to survive the winter that each person needed to make the journey safely. Photographs of the Chilkoot Pass from the winter of 1897 and 1898 show something that looks like a line of ants on a white wall. Thousands of people, tiny against the scale of the mountains, making their way upward one step at a time, carrying everything they owned. It is one of the most extraordinary human movements in the history of the continent. Of those 100,000 or more who started the journey, perhaps 30 to 40,000 actually made it to the Klondike. Of those, perhaps 4,000 found any gold worth mentioning. Of those, perhaps a few hundred found enough gold to justify calling the experience a success. The Great Klondike Gold Rush was, as individual ventures go, mostly a story of failure, hardship, and lost investment. But the failure was distributed among individuals, while the success accrued to the territories through which the stampeders passed. Alaska, as the entry point and the staging area for the rush, received enormous economic benefit from the flood of people and capital. Skagway became a real town with permanent infrastructure. Juneau, which had had its own gold discovery in the early 1880s, grew and developed. The town of Nome, on the Seward Peninsula on Alaska's western coast, had its own entirely separate gold rush in 1899 and 1900, when gold was discovered right on the beach, so close to the surface and so easily accessible that Nome was briefly home to 20,000 people, living in tents, stretched for miles along the shoreline, panning for gold with the simplest of tools. More important than the individual rushes was the transformative effect of the gold rush era on Alaska's infrastructure and population. Towns were built. Roads were cut through wilderness. Telegraph lines were strung. Harbor facilities were improved. The population grew substantially for the first time since the American purchase, and the attention of the American public and of American business turned north in a way it had not done before. The Alaskan fisheries, which Seward had identified as a future resource of enormous potential, began their transformation into one of the great commercial fisheries of the world during this same period. Pacific salmon, 5 species, Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum, running in numbers that staggered the imagination, were the foundation of this industry. The salmon runs of the rivers that drain into the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea were, by any standard, extraordinary natural phenomena. Each summer, millions and then tens of millions of salmon returned from the ocean to the rivers where they had been born, swimming upstream to spawn and die, creating a pulse of biological abundance that the indigenous peoples of Alaska had depended on for millennia. The American salmon canning industry began on the Pacific coast in California in the years immediately after the Civil War, using technology that had been developed during the war to preserve food for troops. The same technology applied to Alaska salmon produced a product, canned salmon, affordable, nutritious, and stable for years without refrigeration, that found a huge market in a world where protein was not always easy to come by. The first salmon cannery in Alaska was established on Clawock on Prince of Wales Island in 1878. By the turn of the 20th century, there were dozens of canneries operating throughout southeast Alaska, on Kodiak Island, in Bristol Bay, and wherever the salmon ran in sufficient numbers to justify the infrastructure. By the 1920s, Alaska was producing tens of millions of cases of canned salmon per year. an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually and employing thousands of permanent residents and tens of thousands of seasonal workers who came north each summer for the cannery season. The fisheries were generating more value each year than the entire purchase price of Alaska, a point that the remaining critics of the purchase were finding increasingly difficult to sustain. The strategic importance of Alaska, which Seward had believed in, but which his critics had dismissed as fantasy, became undeniable during the 20th century in the most direct way possible, through war. When the Second World War came to the Pacific in December of 1941, Alaska's geographical position was suddenly and obviously significant. The territory sat astride the Great Circle routes, the shortest paths across the Pacific Ocean that connect North America to Asia and controlled the approaches to the American continent from the northwest. Any enemy power seeking to strike at the American continent or to interdict American supply lines to Asia had to contend with Alaska's position. Japan understood this. In June of 1942, while the main Japanese and American fleets were fighting the Battle of Midway in the Central Pacific, a Japanese force attacked the Western Aleutians. On June 6th and 7th of 1942, Japanese troops landed on the islands of Kiska and Attu, at the far western end of the Aleutian chain. It was the first occupation of American territory since the War of 1812, more than a century before. The Japanese occupation of the Western Aleutians served multiple strategic purposes. It was intended to anchor the northern end of Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific. It was intended to prevent the United States from using the Aleutians as a base for attacking Japan. The distance from the eastern Aleutians to northern Japan was actually shorter than the distance from Hawaii to Japan, making the Aleutian route a potential American threat. And it was intended to tie down American forces in a distant and difficult theater, preventing their use elsewhere. The American response to the occupation was a campaign that lasted more than a year, and that, even by the brutal standards of the Pacific War, was extraordinarily harsh. The weather in the Western Aleutians is among the worst in the world: dense fog, violent storms, freezing temperatures, and a combination of wind and wet that was utterly miserable for soldiers trained and equipped for more conventional environments. American forces suffered casualties from weather and disease that in some periods exceeded their combat casualties. The Battle of Attu in May of 1943 was one of the most brutal small unit actions of the entire Pacific War. American forces landed on Attu to find approximately 2,500 Japanese soldiers dug into a rugged, fog-shrouded island with no intention of surrendering. The battle lasted 3 weeks. When it was over, 29 American soldiers had been killed and more than 500 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, all but 28 were dead. Most of the final defenders had died in a last desperate charge rather than surrender. The campaign confirmed, in the most painful possible way, exactly what Seward had argued 80 years earlier, that Alaska's strategic position was of the highest importance, and that holding it was worth paying for. The Second World War also transformed Alaska's physical infrastructure in ways that had lasting consequences. The Alaska Highway, the Alcan Highway, as it was called, was built in 1942 by American and Canadian military engineers and civilian workers operating under conditions of extreme urgency. The highway stretched more than 1,500 miles through wilderness, from Dawson Creek in British Columbia through the Yukon to Delta Junction in Alaska, connecting Alaska to the continental North American road system for the first time. Military bases were built throughout Alaska during the war, at Fairbanks, at Anchorage, at Kodiak, at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians, and at dozens of other sites. These bases brought construction workers, soldiers, and eventually their families. The population of the territory, which had been around 70,000 at the start of the war, roughly doubled during the war years. The infrastructure built for military purposes, airfields, roads, harbours, communications, became the foundation on which civilian Alaska would build in the decades that followed. After the war, the push for Alaska statehood accelerated with the renewed energy of people who had demonstrated their commitment to the United States through military service and sacrifice. Alaskans had fought in the war in disproportionate numbers. They had watched their territory be invaded and occupied by a foreign power. They had endured the consequences of being governed as a colonial territory, paying federal taxes without having voting representation in Congress, subject to decisions made in Washington by people who had little knowledge of or interest in Alaskan conditions, and they were tired of it. The argument for statehood was essentially the argument of the American Revolution applied to Alaska. Taxation without representation was wrong, and American citizens deserved the same rights regardless of where they lived. It was difficult to argue with that argument in the abstract. The difficulty was political. Who would benefit from Alaska's admission to the Union, and would those beneficiaries have enough power in Congress to force the issue? The political calculation was complicated by the simultaneous push for Hawaiian statehood. Hawaii was a territory with a different demographic and economic profile from Alaska, more agricultural, more ethnically diverse, with a stronger Republican political establishment, and the admission of one without the other raised questions about political motives. Eventually, and after considerable maneuvering, Congress agreed to admit both territories simultaneously, and on January 3, 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the proclamation making Alaska the 49th state of the United States of America. Alaska's statehood was celebrated enthusiastically by Alaskans who had waited a long time for it, and with somewhat more muted interest by much of the rest of the country, which had a general sense that Alaska was a good thing, but was not entirely clear on why it mattered so much. The answer came in 1968, and it was bigger than anyone had anticipated. The Atlantic Richfield Company, working in partnership with Humble Oil, had been exploring the north slope of Alaska, the vast, flat, treeless, bitterly cold coastal plain north of the Brooks Range, between the mountains and the Arctic Ocean for several years. On March 13, 1968, the Prudhoe Bay State No. 1 well struck oil at a depth of roughly 8,400 feet. The size of the discovery was not immediately clear, but as more wells were drilled in the months that followed, the scale of the find became apparent. Prudhoe Bay contained an estimated 9.6 billion barrels of recoverable oil, the largest oil field ever discovered in North America. To put that number in perspective, the entire United States, at its peak production in the early 21st century, produces about 12 million barrels of oil per day. The Prudhoe Bay field alone contained enough oil to supply the entire country for more than 2 years at that rate. The discovery was, in the most literal sense, a game changer. Getting the oil to market from Prudhoe Bay was its own enormous challenge. The field was on the Arctic coast, connected to the rest of the world by no roads, no pipelines, and no infrastructure of any kind. The Arctic Ocean was ice-covered for most of the year, making tanker access impractical. The oil had to go somewhere, and the only feasible option was to build a pipeline, a very long pipeline, across some very difficult terrain. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was proposed almost immediately after the discovery was announced. The proposed route would carry oil 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay, south across the Brooks Range, through the valleys and forests of interior Alaska, across 3 major mountain ranges and more than 800 streams and rivers to the ice-free port of Valdez on Prince William Sound, from which tankers could carry the oil to West Coast refineries. The proposal immediately became the center of one of the largest and most contentious environmental and legal battles in American history. Environmental groups argued that the pipeline would damage fragile Arctic ecosystems and the permafrost soils that underlay much of its route, with unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. Alaska Native groups, whose land rights in much of the pipeline corridor had never been formally established, filed legal challenges that halted the project pending resolution of those rights. The Alaska Native land claims issue, deferred since the purchase of 1867, became the key obstacle to the pipeline, and this irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. A territory purchased 100 years earlier without any consideration of indigenous land rights could not develop its most valuable resource until those rights were finally addressed. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 was, in significant part, a response to the need to clear the legal path for the pipeline. The act provided Alaska Native peoples with approximately 44 million acres of land and almost $1 billion in compensation, a settlement that was both historically significant and, as we have noted, has been criticized by many Alaska Native leaders as insufficient. With the land claims settled and the environmental challenges partially addressed through regulatory conditions, Congress authorized the pipeline in 1973, in the immediate aftermath of the Arab oil embargo that sent American gasoline prices soaring and made domestic oil production suddenly feel urgent in a way it had not before. Construction began in 1974 and was completed in 1977 at a cost that exceeded $8 billion, the most expensive privately funded construction project in American history at the time. The first oil flowed through the pipeline on June 20th, 1977, and within a few years Alaska was producing roughly 2 million barrels of oil per day, accounting for about a quarter of all domestic American oil production. The financial impact on the state of Alaska was transformative in the most complete sense of that word. Oil royalties and production taxes flooded the state government with revenues beyond anything that had been imagined. The state eliminated its income tax. It funded public services at levels that most states could not approach, and it created something unique in the American experience: the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that invested oil revenues and paid annual dividends directly to every Alaskan resident. The Permanent Fund grew to hundreds of billions of dollars over the following decades, and the annual dividend checks paid to every man, woman, and child who could demonstrate Alaskan residency became one of the most distinctive features of life in the state, a direct payment from natural resource wealth to the citizens who lived above it. The total economic value generated by Alaska since its purchase, oil revenues, fisheries, mining, tourism, federal spending on military installations, the economic activity generated by a population of nearly 750,000 people living in the largest state, is impossible to calculate with precision, but it is measured in the trillions of dollars. Against that background, the purchase price of $7.2 million looks not merely cheap, but almost comedically so. Seward was right. He was not merely right in a general directional sense. He was right in a specific, detailed, and demonstrably accurate sense about what Alaska was and what it could become. He believed in the Pacific. The Pacific has generated extraordinary value for the United States. He believed in Alaska's fisheries. The fisheries have been among the most productive in the world. He believed in Alaska's strategic importance. The strategic importance was demonstrated by war. He believed in Alaska's mineral wealth, even though he could not have known the specific details of what that wealth would prove to be. The mockery of Seward's contemporaries is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a lesson, and the lesson is worth taking seriously. The editors who coined the phrase Seward's Folly were not stupid. They were not ignorant exactly. They were knowledgeable, confident, and sure of their own judgment. They looked at the available evidence and drew what seemed like reasonable conclusions. They were wrong because the available evidence was incomplete, because the future does not announce itself with the clarity that allows confident short-term thinkers to see it, and because the kind of long-horizon thinking that Seward practiced, the kind that asks not what something is worth today, but what it might be worth in 100 years, is genuinely rare and genuinely difficult. It is always difficult to believe that the frozen, apparently empty thing in front of you might be worth more than it appears. It is always difficult to resist the consensus of smart, confident people who say that the dream is foolish. Seward resisted that consensus, bought the frozen dream for 2 cents an acre, and changed the strategic and economic position of the United States in the Pacific in ways that are still being felt today. We have come a very long way tonight. We have travelled from the court of Peter the Great in early 18th century St. Petersburg, through the fog and cold of the Bering Sea, to the rocky shores of the Aleutian Islands, where the sea otters dove and the Promyshleniki hunted with their terrible efficiency. We have followed the Russian fur trade east across the Pacific and watched the Russian-American company build its small, cold, expensive empire on the edge of the world. We have felt the aftershocks of the Crimean War reverberate all the way to the shores of the North Pacific, reshaping the strategic calculations of an empire that found itself, suddenly and painfully, unable to defend everything it claimed. We have sat up late in the State Department with William Seward and Eduard von Stokel, 2 tired but purposeful men in the small hours of March 30th, 1867, listening to the scratch of pens on paper as one of the most consequential real estate deals in the history of the world was being completed while the rest of Washington slept. $7.2 million, 600,000 square miles, 2 cents an acre. We have read the newspapers that called the whole thing a colossal folly, that invented nicknames and filled their columns with contempt for a man they thought had taken leave of his senses. We have watched the money move through the corridors of Congress as the appropriation fought its long, complicated, not entirely clean way to passage. We have thought about the people who were never in any of those rooms when the deal was made, the Tlingit, the Aleut, the Athabascan, the Yupik and Inupiat peoples who had lived in Alaska for thousands of years and who found themselves, by the stroke of a pen, in a distant city, transferred from one empire to another without their knowledge or consent. Their story is long and complex and still unfolding, and we have watched, across the decades and the centuries, the slow and ultimately overwhelming vindication of Seward's vision, the gold rushes that brought tens of thousands of people north, the fisheries that fed millions, the military importance revealed by a world war, the oil that transformed a remote and beautiful territory into one of the wealthiest places per capita on Earth. All of that from 2 cents an acre. There is something in this story that feels, the more you sit with it, like a meditation on the nature of value and of time. The things that look worthless today are not necessarily worthless. The things that look absurd in the present moment do not necessarily look absurd in retrospect. Time has a way of changing the light in which we see everything, and what appears to be ice and desolation and emptiness sometimes turns out to be the foundation for something extraordinary. Seward understood this. or at least he felt it, in the way that people who are right about large things often feel their rightness before they can fully articulate it. He looked at the same frozen wilderness that everyone else saw, and he saw something different. He saw the North Pacific and its commercial future. He saw the great circle routes that would eventually carry the freight of a globalized economy. He saw, however dimly and however far away, the outline of what Alaska would eventually be. He bought a frozen wilderness for 2 cents an acre, endured years of mockery and political difficulty, and died before he was proved correct. But he was proved correct. The mockery has long since faded. The folly turned out to be wisdom. And the territory he purchased, the great land, Alyeska, Alaska, stands today as the largest state in the Union, a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary resources, a reminder that the world is larger and stranger and more generous than our short-term thinking generally allows us to appreciate. That is the story of Alaska. That is the story of Seward's Folly. Let the history settle around you gently, the way snow settles on a distant mountain, soft and slow and covering everything in quiet white. Let the stories sink into the warmth of the bed and the dark of the room. Let William Seward and Eduard von Stokel have their long sleep as they have been sleeping for 150 years. Let the ships of the Russian-American company sail slowly into the fog of the past. Let the sea otters swim undisturbed in the cold waters of the northern Pacific. You know something now that you did not know before you came here tonight. You know the price of a frozen dream and the patience required for the world to recognize its value. You know that vision sometimes looks like foolishness until it doesn't. You know that the most important decisions are sometimes made in the middle of the night by tired men with pens, while the rest of the world sleeps just as you are about to sleep now. This has been Sleepless History. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. If you found tonight's journey through the past useful or enjoyable, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone in your life who might benefit from a long, quiet trip through the archives of human experience. New episodes come regularly, and there are always more stories waiting in the dark. Stories of the remarkable, the overlooked, the curious, and the surprising. Until next time, stay curious, stay restful, and remember, even the most boring history has something extraordinary hiding inside it, if you know where to look. Good night.